I'd like to welcome everybody back to Buford Pusser, the other story. Before I get started today, I would like to address something that has occurred to me, and that being that a lot of people think that I'm really negative about Buford. I guess that's the reason why I call this the other story, because there's a lot of movies, books, Facebook pages that hold Buford out as a hero. I see the other side of the story. Now, I will say that Buford, like any other sheriff, did some good while he was serving his terms as Sheriff of McNairy County. However, I feel like that there are a lot of things that he could have done better, and that's what this video series is here to point out, and what my Facebook page is there to point out. Now, the Pusser legend is exactly that, a legend. Well, what is a legend? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a legend as being a story in historical fashion that is also, how can you put it, unverifiable. Now, you have to ask, how do we get past this? Well, the easiest way to get past all this is to forget everything that you think you know about Buford, start all over and start doing some actual research like I have done. And you're going to find out that, yeah, some of the stories about Buford are true, but many of them are not. But today, in this particular episode, we're going to talk about Buford getting into law enforcement. As you know, that after his trial at the for the Plantation Club robbery, he returned to Illinois, and he stayed up there in the Chicago area for some time, returning here in 1962. You know, employment was not good in McNairy County. You know, he was doing the best he could. He took a job at a local store and, you know, rented a home there where he was taking care of his family. A little bit later, he was able to rent a house. And, you know, his dad was chief of police in Adamsville, which Adamsville was a very small town, 800 plus people at the time. And Carl managed to talk the city fathers into hiring Buford as a patrolman. I'm not sure how a town the size of 800 people needs two people, but two officers, but I guess that was the case. But Buford started working there with Carl in 1962. You know, there wasn't a whole lot going on. You know, he wrote some speeding tickets, took care of an occasional drunk, that sort of thing. But Adamsville certainly was nothing like the state line. There was almost no crime in that little community. Everybody knew everybody else, and nobody was wanting to make trouble for anyone else. Now, back in 1957, Carl had been injured in a single vehicle accident, in which he really did a number on his hip. You know, after Buford got a little experience under his belt, well, Carl decided that he would retire, and he talked the city fathers into allowing Buford to take his position as chief of police. And, you know, that gave Buford a start in law enforcement. Of course, that was all well and good for a while, but, you know, in a small town, a guy like Buford naturally felt like there was more that he could be doing. So he eventually decided to run for the Constable of the 3rd Judicial District in McNairy County, or Civil District in McNairy County. And he won that election. And of course, that encompassed a lot of territory around Adamsville. That allowed him to kind of expand his law enforcement career. That was a lot of rural territory that he could go out and look for moonshiners, things like this. And all that worked out pretty well for quite some time. You know, he got to know Sheriff James Dickey. And to Sheriff Dickey's credit, he was a mentor to Buford. He taught him a lot of ins and outs about rural Tennessee law enforcement. He even took him along on raids in other districts where that they would be taking down a moonshine still, things of that nature, and gave Buford some practical experience about what a law officer was supposed to do. Of course, it also taught him that there might possibly be some money to be made if you were sheriff. So in 1964, the Republican Party was without a candidate in McNairy County, and they were having a primary. Buford decided that he would throw his hat into the ring, and it's just my personal opinion that he probably had some help from Carl with this. Carl probably had a plan for Buford. It's just my suspicions, but it's based on the entire story that I've arrived at that feeling. But at any rate, Buford entered the race, got the primary, and so he was looking at having to run in the general election against an incumbent, Sheriff James Dickey, the one who had taken the time to mentor Buford. I've always found that a little bit strange that Buford could do that to someone that helped him out so much, but that's the way it was. There was also another candidate that we never heard about in the movie Walking Tall, and that would be George Weatherford, who was a local businessman. When he did not win his primary, he decided that he would run for sheriff as an independent, which meant that the sheriff's race was going to be a three-way race. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't know is that Sheriff Dickey was under a microscope at the time. The TBI was aware that he was not really playing on the up and up, taking some payoffs from especially moonshiners, but some from the state liners. And he was also under the microscope of H.M. Ray, who was the U.S. Attorney for the Northern Division of the Attorney General's office. At any rate, Dickey was planning on running, being reelected, and so on. Buford knew that it was very, very difficult to beat an incumbent sheriff back in those days especially. And it's not to say that it's not the same now. An incumbent definitely has an advantage in a race if he's done a good job for the citizens of his county. Buford felt like he needed a way to better his position. So, as a constable of the 3rd Civil District of McNairy County, he decided, and I have a feeling that it was with Carl Pusser's input, that he was going to start making raids down on the state line in order to get some support from the people of the county. During the campaign, Buford and Carl did indeed go down and raid the joints there at the state line, made a couple of arrests, confiscated a lot of beer, so on and so forth. And of course, as one would expect, it made a little bit of a flash in the local papers that here you had this young constable who was going down to the state line and doing things that Sheriff Dickey wouldn't do. The only problem was that Buford was out of his jurisdiction and none of the charges were going to stick. In fact, he had to return everything that he had confiscated during the raids there. Now, Jack and Louise Hathcock, they had been operating the state line much as they had in previous years, selling bootleg whiskey and running the razzle game, trying to get money from paying patrons however they could there at the Shamrock. And at the time, there was a third individual that we all know of, Carl Douglas Towhead White. Now, Towhead started working at the state line years before under Jack, And he had always kind of come and gone there at the state line, but he saw an opportunity at the state line. He wanted to become known as the Al Capone of the South. So one of the things that he decided that he might do is see if he could get in good with Louise. Now, something most people don't know, or a lot of people don't understand, is that Jack and Louise got a divorce in 1957, in September of that year. Now, they had continued to operate the state line just like they always had. You know, Jack pretty much kept his activities up at the newly built White Iris Club, while that Louise ran things there at the state line. With Towhead getting involved, he began to, how can I put it, manage things there at the Shamrock for Louise. And, you know, she let him get away with more and more things that she and Jack would never have done in the first place. Of course, Towhead was a smart guy. He was playing on Louise Hathcock's emotions. He was young, he was handsome, and he at least pretended to be interested in a romance with Louise. And of course, unfortunately, she fell for it. That gave him the opportunity to introduce some things that Jack would never have allowed. I think Jack probably protested about some of this, even though there wasn't a whole lot that he could do, seeing as that he and Louise were no longer married. But over a period of time, Towhead realized that he needed to be rid of Jack, that Jack was impeding some of his plans to take over the state line and do even more than they were. Of course, he presented a plan, it's my understanding, to Louise, saying, hey, if we can get rid of Jack, here's some things that, you know, we can do. And I assume that Louise, not wanting to disappoint Towhead, decided to go along with what he was suggesting. In the process of doing so, they actually made a plan to get rid of Jack. Now, this would occur on May 22nd of 1964. This of course, is well before the election and before that Buford became sheriff, which we'll get into a little bit later, but the fact is that on May 22nd, Jack was lured to room number 1 of the Shamrock Motel, which was, of course, Louise Hathcock's private living quarters. Now, something that a lot of people don't know is that Louise often kept rooms 2 and 3 for family members. And at this particular time, she had family members staying there. On the night that Jack was lured over, Towhead, Louise, and Jack got into an argument. And of course, it was all pre-planned. Well, staying in room number 2 was Bobby Anderson, Jack and Louise Hathcock's nephew. He heard what was going on. He was 14 years old at the time. He wandered into the room to see if he could help put a stop to all the arguing. Of course, this upset Louise, and she forced Bobby back through the adjoining door that connected rooms 1 and 2, telling him that no 14-year-old boy was going to tell her what to do. As she pushed him back into the room, she locked the door so he couldn't get back in. Shortly thereafter, I mean, almost immediately, shots were fired, and Jack wandered out the front door of the motel room and headed over back toward the restaurant. Another thing a lot of people don't realize is that Jack kept a room in the back of the restaurant. Those were his living quarters. It was a very small room in which that he had a bed, but they also stored a lot of liquor that was sold there at the state line. He didn't quite make it to the restaurant area. however, because he collapsed in between the motel and the restaurant. They had to contact both James Dickey, who was the sheriff of McNairy County at the time, along with Cleeton Wilbanks, who was sheriff of Alcorn County, to come up and investigate, because people weren't sure exactly which state that Jack was in. When Cleeton Wilbanks got there, they decided that apparently that since the shooting portion of this occurred in McNairy County, that Sheriff James Dickey ought to be the one to investigate the crime. Of course, Dickey was on the Shamrock's payroll, so we could pretty much tell where that was headed, because Louise would say that Jack came in and that he assaulted her, attempted to rape her, and that she shot him with a .38 caliber. Of course, Jack was hit several times in the chest and in the neck and died. After the investigation was completed, of course, no charges were filed against Louise, and she was free to go her own way again. Now, while the odds were changing in the sheriff's election due to these events, the raid that Pusser had made, the death of Jack Hathcock, everything was beginning to look more favorable for Buford, although it wasn't quite as good as he had hoped it would be. And, it's been suggested by several people who know the story that Buford, and possibly with the help of Carl, came up with the plan that in order for Buford to get elected, that they had to eliminate Sheriff James Dickey from the race. Well, here we go. There's different stories about James Dickey and what happened to him. Of course, as many of us know, he was killed in an automobile accident just before the election. You have Sergeant McClanahan, who was with the Tennessee Highway Patrol, that said that Dickey had been down by the state line early that morning to investigate a traffic accident. And however, you also have W.O. Hathcock, who once, when he was asked what was the worst thing that he could recall ever happening at the state line, he replied the way that Sheriff James Dickey died. Now, you would have thought that he would have possibly gone back to the time that he was beaten and robbed there at the Plantation Club, but no, he was more concerned about what happened to Sheriff Dickey. W.O.'s story was that Towhead, Dickey, and Pusser were all at the Shamrock restaurant early that morning. And of course, it was a pre-planned thing, according to some, that Dickey was there. That particular day, he was driving a car other than his own patrol vehicle, which was in the shop for maintenance. And he had gotten a loaner from the dealership. And the conversation turned to who might have the faster car, Buford or the one that Dickey was driving. And Towhead is said to have egged on a little race between the two when they left the restaurant that morning. They were going to get on Highway 45, head north, and see who had the faster car. Well, as we all know, about a mile north of the state line, Dickey's car left the roadway, went down an embankment, and hit a tree. This caused him to be ejected from the vehicle, and he died about 30 minutes later. Now with Dickey out of the race, it was between the Republican Buford Pusser and the Independent George Weatherford, again, who we'd never heard about in Walking Tall. Now, of course, stories would have it, especially in Walking Tall, that the State Line Syndicate got together and raised a lot of money trying to defeat Buford. so on and so forth. Well, what actually happened was that with Sheriff Dickey being killed in the state of Tennessee, state law calls that in the event that a sheriff is unable to fulfill his duties, that the county coroner steps in and serves until another sheriff can be elected or one is appointed by county officials. So Ward Moore became the interim sheriff. Now, even prior to this happening, he had been advised by other authorities that he needed to be ready to step in and take over as sheriff because of plans that the state had to bring Sheriff Dickey up on charges. Ward Moore, when I interviewed him, told me that he was kind of surprised when he got the call that he needed to step in, and when he learned that it wasn't due to the fact that they were bringing charges against Dickey, but rather that Dickey was dead. Moore also told me that his first day as interim sheriff, he had not even made it to the sheriff's office yet to really get any work done until he received a call from Louise Hathcock, who was telling him that, well, her horse had died midstream right before the election, and she needed to buy a new one, meaning that Dickey was dead. As far as she was concerned, he was going to be a shoo-in, but now that he was gone, she was going to have to buy another sheriff. And so she asked Ward Moore to send both Buford and Weatherford down to the state line to meet with her. And of course, Moore told me that only one of them made the trip down there, but he wouldn't say which one. Now, as we all know, when the election took place, Buford won, but it wasn't like we were told in Walking Tall, because in Walking Tall, their version of it was that Buford barely defeated a dead sheriff. Even W.R. Morris would write that Pusser only beat James Dickey by 307 votes. Well, the truth of the matter is that James Dickey received a total of 307 votes, while Buford Pusser received 3,288 votes, and Weatherford received 3,040 votes, basically meaning that Buford beat George Weatherford. So it wasn't like what we saw in the movies, nothing like some of these fan pages tell us. It's a totally different story. Now Buford was in the driver's seat. He was going to be sheriff of McNairy County. And of course, back in the 60s, a sheriff had a lot of power in a small county, especially one like McNairy County, which is mostly rural. There's only 28,000 residents in the county at that time. So that kind of being sheriff kind of made him as king of the county. And of course, that was going to allow him to do a lot of things that we're going to cover in future episodes that will be surprising to some people, not so much to others. But at any rate, what we've tried to demonstrate here is that this is how legends work. The legend tells you one thing, the facts tell you something else. And the Pusser legend was exactly that. It was a historical event that was not supported by factual information. So I think for today, we'll leave it at that. We'll be getting into what all happened after Buford took the oath of office, what he went on to do, what raids that he performed, some of the dishonest acts that he was involved in. But at any rate, it gets to be a really interesting story from this point on. At any rate, I would ask people to really research this, kind of open up your minds. If you think you know a lot about Buford Pusser, chances are you need to forget a lot of what you think you know and start all over and from the beginning and learn the true story. It's like I always say, the truth has no agenda, and this story is the same way. So, folks, join us next time, and I hope to see you then.